let's return to our ground for a moment, our negative blank square. And let's divide that space. This is what's known as division of space or structure. So we can divide the space, and we can use color, we can use a linear element like a line, we can use texture, photographs, whatever. And so what we've done now is we've divided that space equally into two areas. Now what we've really done is we've created two white rectangles with the division between them. So again, going back to the point where we had right in the center, this is the same thing. It basically divides the space into two equal spaces. It's stagnant, it's stable, and it's pretty boring. By moving it just slightly one way or the other, it makes it more dramatic and more interesting to look at. Moving it even further creates even more of a dynamic relationship. If we move the element onto an angle, it creates even more dynamic, because now that angle is juxtaposed against the horizontal and vertical format of our square, and it now has a sense of contrast as well. So if you want to make something interesting, put it on an angle. Here's what a lot of people do when they're first starting out. They divide the space equally into two triangles, right? So now what we've really done is we've created an arrow that leaves and an arrow that leaves, or a line that leaves or it leaves. So basically what we've done is we've given our viewer 4 reasons to leave the composition. Clearly we don't want to do that. So again, if we want to make something more interesting and less stagnant, we just move it off to one side a little bit, one way or the other, and bingo, you now have a lot of drama, and your composition now engages the viewer a little bit more dramatically. So let's divide our space again. Now we are looking at essentially that horizon line, right? And everybody has taken pictures at the beach where your friend is, on the beach, and you're shooting toward the ocean. And where's the ocean? Right across the middle of the picture, right? So again, this just creates a very, very boring composition. Again, move it up or move it down, but do something. Now, watch up here for a moment. There's a concept called the rule of thirds. And if you divide something into threes, you create a much more dramatic composition. The rule of thirds is something that you want to keep in mind for forever, essentially, because that is something that creates the dynamic of space. You'll notice that if you're looking at, say, landscape architecture, it's rare that you have 2 plants next to each other. Usually there's 3, one tall, one medium, and one small, creating a sense of contrast between the 3 elements, but also creating a sense of balance between the 3 elements. So that's very important to keep in mind. Okay. So let's take a look. Again, if you wanted to make it more dramatic, move the horizon line up or move it down. It's always a good way of changing your perspective. So let's talk about dividing the space. Okay, now what we've done is we've created, what else? A bullseye, right? This is now the crosshairs of a rifle, and our eye goes right to the middle where the target would be, and we're done. We've also essentially just created 4 squares divided by 2 black lines, right? So again, stagnant, stable, not that interesting. Don't do this either, because now what you've done is created a checkerboard. And so we all know what checkerboards are. They're a pattern, they're repetitious, they're stagnant, they're not too interesting. So again, move it off to one side or another, just be more dramatic with it. If we flip this to the left, you'll notice that this is a very common structure for websites, right? You have your logo, your navigation, and maybe more navigation in your content. More dramatic, move it even further off to one side or the other. Is it useful? We're really just sort of looking at it from the standpoint of interest, not necessarily something that we could actually use. Or put it on an angle. That's always you can almost never go wrong putting something on an angle. It's very powerful. So let's talk a little bit now about structure. Structure is essentially when we divide the space, and it creates a grid, if you will, that allows us to align elements to that grid. So to make the grid more interesting, we'll add one more or less vertical element. It's at an angle. And then we start playing around with shapes. The grid helps us to put shapes and orient them in such a way that they feel like they're related by size, proportion, or position. This would be known as an active grid. It's telling us specifically where to put the elements. Now, a grid can be visible or invisible, and it can also impact the shapes by cropping them or interfering with them in some other way. So now we've got a grid that's breaking or cropping these elements, and the grid is still visible, right? So now let's make the grid invisible and see what happens. And so now we have, again, the shapes feel organized. They feel like they are related, but we don't see the grid anymore. You can also fill the grid with value, color, images, whatever. And this creates both a visible, active, dynamic grid. And so it's a very powerful way of breaking up space. So this is essentially the elements of the essential concepts of 2D design. And that's it.